Welcome to Educational Alpha. Kaya CEO and host Bill Kelly brings you on-the-ground conversations with business leaders, educators, coaches, and industry colleagues from around the globe. In this episode, Bill welcomes Dr. Margaret Cullen to the discussion about all things governance. A preeminent person in the field of governance in Ireland, Dr. Cullen brings fascinating insight into the world of corporate and investment fund administration. Listen in.
Welcome to the latest edition of Educational Alpha, where the investor's edge starts with informed consent. I'm your host, Bill Kelly, and today I'm joined by my good friend, Dr. Margaret Cullen. Margaret, great to see you.
Great to see you too, Bill. Good to be here.
I think we first met in Ireland, in Dublin, which, given the last name like Kelly, I have a certain affinity for that part of the world. But I like to start these conversations off by a little bit of background. I know quite a bit about it. The listeners don't. So maybe who is Margaret Cullen and what brought you to where you are today? And I think governance is going to be an interesting topic for us to explore, but maybe I'll start with an introduction.
Yeah, gosh, that's a while ago now, Bill. I say 2014, 2015. And I guess for the purpose of your listeners, I grew up in the asset management industry and jumped away from an executive role in 2005, I think, to pursue a PhD in the area of fund governance, very much through the lens of the investment manager. And we met fortuitously, Bill, when I was engaged by the Institute of Banking to develop a program relating to fund governance. And you happened to be in Dublin, I think around 2014, where I was very keen maybe to partner with that program, to partner with an investment management or organization or education provider to tap into their knowledge and their expertise and their agility in the delivery of investment management education that would twin very nicely with a program that was focused on governance. So I think that was the marriage made in heaven, Bill. So I've evolved. I moved a little bit on from there. I'm still that program. I no longer run, but it's still run by the Institute of Banking. And in parallel, I run a equivalent program for bank directors, the Certified Bank Director program. But I also lecture for University College Dublin and I consult in the area of governance and particularly the area of board evaluations, which I do with the Institute of Directors in Ireland. So I've quite a spread of things that I do, but I guess the common denominator, Bill, as you know, is governance, whether it's fund governance, bank governance, corporate governance. That's where that, along with education, are my two passions.
A lot there, and it's interesting. You alluded to this. I know it more by our relationship, but you started out a little bit in the 40 Act space, and maybe a lot of your career now is focused on the UCITS. And the wrapper and the regulator can be very, very different. But being a fiduciary should not require a passport. There should only be one standard. And if I had to sum it up, do right by the client. And all of the work you've done in the past and what you're currently doing now is bringing more professionalism into the boardroom. And in the good old days, you could have an illustrious career and retire at 60 some odd years old and sit on a board and off you go. And I think that model worked for maybe for decades, but you and I have talked many times, Margaret, about the pace of change and innovation and democratization of product where the average investor can get access to private equity and hedge funds and structured products. And on the one hand, that's a good thing. But if it's not done with education and maybe a director being sort of the judge, jury, and executioner for how and when somebody gets access is important. So what began this evolutionary path for you? And maybe you were born this way, where you must have seen something that others didn't, because I think you were early in saying, "Hey, we got to think about a more organized and professional route for the director." But was there a sea change somewhere, or is this how you've always been wired?
I think I've always been inquisitive, so that's something. Ask my parents about that, Bill. But for me, it was back in my industry days, sitting at the boardroom of clients. I worked for a service provider in Dublin, a US service provider that had a really, strong portfolio of mostly US investment management clients. So sitting at the board of their funds and kind of listening and watching to what was being discussed and how it was being discussed. That's not casting any doubt or aspersion on anybody around that table. But I developed a real knowledge, I suppose, keen interest in how the interests of investors were actually being safeguarded. Bill, you and I have talked extensively about the difference between Europe and the US, particularly with Europe and that overarching regulatory challenge of the fund that's promoted to the investor, the domicile of that fund often being different to the investment management domicile, and how that, I guess, is handled from a regulatory perspective. And it was that challenge, that dichotomy for the European regulators that kind of pushed me into do my PhD in fund governance, and then evolved into a program that I developed. And of course, I still write on this, I still do a little bit of research on this, and of course, I still teach on this. So it's that kind of that's the real genesis of it. For me, both as a consumer of investment product and also as a producer of investment product, it is about transparency. It is about clarity. It is about transparency, not only in the way we offer a product, investment product to, retail investors or indeed more sophisticated investors. So it's the transparency around that, but it also is the nature of the assurance that investors can enjoy in relation to the system of governance around that product. So they're areas that have always really interested me. So it is literally little old me sitting in the boardroom, absorbing it all and kind of debating what are the questions we're not asking. What are the areas of focus we're not giving this boardroom? And that's really what prompted me to kind of move into this space.
I don't know if I first heard it from you when we met now close to a decade ago, but this the concept of an AIF, alternative investment fund, and what that truly means, and maybe at the heart of it is democratization. And I want to talk a little bit about that in a moment, but just as a headline, democratization of product to the more retail-oriented investor, good thing or bad thing?
You mightn't want to hear this, Bill, but I sometimes struggle with the concept of the financial literacy of the retail investor to deal with the risks, no matter how transparent we are in our disclosures, and no matter how, and notwithstanding, and that's taking the system of governance, of internal governance around the AIF for granted. I would challenge the capacity of the financial literacy of the average retail investor to absorb that. And I'm not sure whether investors, whether it's through intermediaries, are getting the financial advice and really understand the downside risk. So I'm not sure if that's a problem for the industry to solve, but it certainly is a problem for policymakers to resolve. And I think that there's a lot of work that can be done. But here's the thing, Bill, in a world where you talk about searching for alpha in a world where we have really moved away from defined benefit pensions, where most jurisdictions have quite a significant pension crisis, whereby either people do not have a pension or they may have a pension, but in no way will equip them to be financially safe in their retirement. I think that people are looking for that return. And I think it's just equating that need with, I think, a financial literacy gap. And, Bill, I don't know if it's something that the investment management industry can do more on. I know even I keep an eye very closely to the Investment Association in the UK. They are my go-to place in relation to, I guess they're a very good proxy for me to what the investor is thinking. And the asset management industry is thinking, particularly in the area of corporate governance when I'm teaching on corporate governance. And, they've really done a lot on that literacy side, but I think there's probably more to do.
Your very first point, hard to take the other side on the financial literacy, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But I saw a stat, and this might be U.S. based, Margaret, but I think probably is globally true. It was a PwC report, and they looked at the various cohorts of savers. And I'm doing this from memory, but I'm on the right zip code. The cohort from 50 to 65 years old, that 15-year spread, the median investor had $150,000 saved for retirement. If you're 50 years old, you take that 150 and divide by 40, which is maybe the life expectancy, then divide by 12, and you're going to come up with the amount of money that's barely going to fill your tank with gas at current prices. And oftentimes this money is set aside in a tax deferred manner. So it's got to come out and you got to pay taxes on it as well. So to some people, 150 may sound like a reasonably good sized nest egg, but we want to retire early and we're living longer. And we saw this tremendous upheaval in France once again, and they're trying to raise the retirement age from like 60 to 62. It's absurd where we are. But back to your point, I absolutely agree that the literacy is not there. And it's really a very difficult, almost Hobson esque type choice that we're giving these individuals because it's not a question of the 60/40 dead or alive. And it's not a question of gathering the illiquidity premium, the complexity premium. To me, that is nonsense that the end consumer is not going to understand. But if you look at where capital formation and value creation is happening, it's in the private markets, full stop. So if you and I have to manage our own retirement, and our only option is these very mature companies in the public space, and all this innovation is happening privately, we've got to figure out how to get there. Now, maybe the wizards in Washington, D.C. can solve this. I don't know if I have much hope for that. But it's interesting, and maybe I'm going to formulate this into a question, getting back to something you said. What is the role of the policymakers, and how much attention should they be paying to this? Or should we keep kicking this down the road, which seems to be what we'll want to do?
I think politicians globally kick it down the road, Bill. I see it here in Ireland. I know there's like focus here in Ireland about bringing in auto enrollment on pensions and so on, from an early age. So going to your point, there are a number of aspects. I'll search for a return to keep me comfortable in retirement, but do I need to go for the higher risk or do I need to start earlier and accumulate? And so policymakers, they're not mutually exclusive, by the way, but I think for me, policymakers, they have to take this bull by the horns. You know, as I said, the change in the pension fund landscape globally, right? And if you take Ireland as an example, the whole structure in Ireland has changed considerably over the last 20 years from the move from DB scheme to DC scheme. Scenarios where we've a somewhat of a purchasing house crisis here because we don't have enough supply, and there's affordability issues. So you have people maybe going through their adult life not purchasing that asset, and then looking at the face of retirement without that asset and having to sustain paying rent and so on. So we have so many different policy issues that are intertwined. So for me, to answer your question in a long way, Bill, I think this is something that we need policymakers to address, to take a long term view, not just think about the next election, to take a long term view and say, what are the key issues we have to address? But for me, this goes back to the classroom. I had Billy. I mean, you've met my daughters, and one of my daughters, I was helping her last night with. She's been emergency taxed, and she couldn't figure out how to get her emergency tax back. And I went, "Woe is me that this kind of basic things aren't untaught in the classroom." This is about going back to early stages of education and socializing very early on the idea of saving, investing, risk return, those kind of concepts integrating them into the education system from very early on, and making sure that they're part of your psyche, your DNA. I think awareness by policymakers, and I guess just making sure that they're creating the dialogue on this, and that there isn't this perception that, well, you can rely on the state for your pensions, or that you can't, that it's the focus that it is appropriate and it is a must have to save for the future. So I really believe there's a number of facets, and primarily through education. Yeah. I mean, you go to the US, and I could jump into a cab and talk to a taxi driver, and they'll talk about their investments, their mutual funds investments, and what's that, something K, whatever, I forget the name, but they will talk about their investments, less so in the European context.
The 401k is our wrapper. But I will tell you that I was in Uber the other day, and the Uber driver was naming cryptocurrencies that I'd never heard of before. So I got a little bit of a schooling in the wonderful world of cryptos, and by age and temperament, I'm sort of the cohort that I should be very dismissive of cryptos, and I don't own them because I don't understand them, and whether it's a bubble or not, I don't know. It's So we'll put that aside. But what I do find interesting, though, is the plumbing, the distributed ledger, and the blockchain, and that might be the type of innovation perhaps where we could find maybe more of a tradable market for investors to be able to get in and out of some of these private holdings. But again, it's got to be done with a fair amount of gates. And I have seen there's been at least one big PE firm, KKR, who's issued a private fund on the blockchain that it's a feeder fund off a Cayman-based fund. So theoretically, it's got the same NAV as the Cayman-based fund. What have the developments been like either in Dublin or the Eurozone in utilizing either blockchain technology? I assume these UCITS cannot hold cryptos. Maybe they can. I don't.
No, I mean, I think that they would be on the other end of the risk spectrum, but we are seeing the emergence of funds in the alt space, and certainly the ability to service them. But actually, just to pick up on the point of that Uber conversation, what is the source of the education of that Uber driver? Where are they getting their information? And, and the kind of social media as a source. That old adage, if it's too good to be true, it most likely is too good to be true. If it sounds too good to be true, it most likely is. So I think the source of that education is absolutely key. But again, on your second question, there is certainly that level of activity. I'm not overly involved in it, Bill, to be perfectly honest. And a bit like you, I have spent a lot of time trying to get under the bonnet. Blockchain, I understand very much. I get that, but the risk return trade off of the crypto and the mechanics of it, it's something that I would veer away from myself because I don't understand it. So that would be my philosophy.
Yeah, I think we can leave that one there. But it's maybe one takeaway from this. I think your daughters and my kids, and you've got a lovely family I've had the pleasure of meeting. I think they have the benefit of somebody like you and I that have spent our career in financial services. And when kids are younger, they don't necessarily listen to everything you say, but some of those habits rinse off on them. But I was having a dinner conversation with my youngest son, Will, just about a year or so ago, and he just turned 18, as you know, and he has a Robinhood account, which I didn't know. And he's got a little bit of money saved up from various things, and if it blows it all, he'll survive, and he'll come to me when he needs money to go see a movie. But the fact that some of these young kids are understanding the commerce of investing and taking a loss early, I think these are good things, and we should embrace them. But then do try to wrap it in with education, because I think that separates a very casual market participant focusing on day traded gains into a longer term investor. And I think it's important that we bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think that's hitting the nail on the head in every way. You know, my eldest will graduate from university in 18 months' time, everything going
Amazing.
well. And I know it's incredible. She turned 21 last week. It's just incredible. I'm officially old, Bill. But I think the interesting thing is that, what I would be instilling, I have instilled in her would be to start that investment small, commensurate with with what you're earning and build, was something that my parents would have instilled in me, as your salary increases, maintain that proportion and I guess err on, and it's a bit like everything else, there's a risk return trade off in so many aspects of life. Understanding that risk return trade off and how do you get access to good financial advice? And I think, Bill, that's the key thing for a lot of investment managers out there who use intermediaries, qualified financial advisors, are people getting the right advice? And is the regulatory framework such that actually there is that provision of good advice? In other words, will people pay for it? Who will pay for it? Is it the end user? Is it the retail investor? Is it the investment manager? Who pays for the provision of that investment advice, that good quality investment advice? And this is the thing with regulation. I'm not as au fait with the way it would roll in the US, but certainly my sense, whether it's the UK or other areas of Europe, sometimes I think my sense is that it's getting so difficult to provide in financial advice now. I mean, I recently, well, 2 years ago when I left, executive employment and kind of went out, but more on my own, I had to set up my own pension. And it was amazing to me how regulatory led the process was by means of, trying to get a sense of, well, you filled out this questionnaire. This gives me a sense of your view on risk taking and so on. And so there was that kind of very quantifiable, I could tick a few boxes. It came out with a number for me and put me on a scale, but there wasn't really that overarching qualitative assessment and really, that sense of bringing me into so that I can understand the variety of options there were out there, Bill. And so, the thing with regulation is sometimes they try to protect the investor, but actually what they might do is prohibit the investor from getting really good, solid quality advice. There were so many different facets to this. I'd love to see it start in the classroom, Bill. I'd love to say the 401k you mentioned, and that's the wrapper, but I'd love to see it start right there, from kids in junior school going into high school, that they're educated about this, and so and they understand the concepts, and then and that could be something that's almost a given. It's like your three R's, and then you add one on. Risk, a fourth or risk return, a fifth or. Does that make sense? Reading,
It
writing,
does.
take risk
Yeah.
and return. So I think that they are, for me, that's the real key policy initiative I'd love to see.
Yeah, and I think you said something very important there too, Margaret, is that it's not easy being a regulator. And I think the resting pulse is to protect that investor through regulation. And it's more the concept of teaching the investor how to fish, protect them through education and transparency. And if you can get that right, and that's a very hard thing to do, it's like painting a bridge you've never done. But if you can get that right, then you don't have to worry about the access so much because you sort of launch them. Very, very hard to do, very hard to do consistently. And I think the easiest thing to do is say, no, you can't have access. Or if you have access, you can't do this, that, and the other thing. And then the wrapper, either 40 Act or UCIT, has rinsed out the value proposition of diversification from the get-go, and you may as well go buy an index. So we're coming up toward the end here, Margaret, and I like to end these with a closing observation or a takeaway under the broad heading of educational alpha to give the investor something that they should be able to get access to. Education should still be a free lunch. And any closing thoughts that you have for the listeners?
You know my feeling. I am absolutely passionate about education. Bill, you and I've had this conversation before. When it comes to education, I never like education being packaged as a product. To me, it is not something that's sold. It's an investment by an individual in themselves. And that's what Kaya do so well, because you evolve with the industry and you enable that investment by people who want to invest. So whether it's at your end or my end and an executive education, or whether it's the more early end of people's career, or indeed when they're still in teenage years, access to education is power, and power is potential, and that's what we want. You know, education breaks down barriers. It allows us to contribute to the discourse. It allows us to lean in. So to me, that's something that I will always champion. I hate to see it commoditized, or and used in that way. It's interesting. I know, kind of slightly over time, but if people come to me and say, Margaret, I'm interested in doing your program because they want the designation, they may or may not come on the program after our conversation, but really, I'm more interested in people who want the journey. They want the journey, they want the investment in themselves on that journey, and the outcome. That's whether it's letters after their name, or whatever. That's a great thing to have, but it's all about the journey, and that education starts from the moment you leave the womb. Bill, we're learning, and it's important, for me, that access, regardless of socioeconomic background, that access is given and provided. And again, that's another key role for policymakers.
I agree. Cradle to grave, and maybe to be continued. Margaret, next time I'm over in Dublin, you and Philip Craig took me to some great off the beaten path Irish bars, and maybe we can settle this over a Guinness when I'm there. So thank you. It's great to see you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I look forward to that. Okay, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Margaret. Please join us on the next segment of Educational Alpha as we look to always put the investor first through transparency, education, and informed consent.